Okay, welcome everybody. I hope you all progressed from the waiting room to this main chat here. It's a pleasure to have. I mean, you don't see it, but there's very many people that registered, so it's great to see there's many people interested in taxation and the global implications of the global tax implications of the latest developments that we see in the US, but also everywhere. So it was a big breakthrough and indeed a big celebration when in 2021 won the G20 countries and along them with them more than 120 other countries that are members of the so-called inclusive framework agreed on implementing a global minimum tax of 15% for large corporations. The agreement has a long history. It goes back to at least 2015 when the OECD published its BEPS. So that's a word that you will hear today a lot. BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting recommendations. So after this, landmark agreement in 2021, the EU went ahead and in 2022 passed directive on the, EU-wide implementation of the minimum tax, which then had to be transposed to national law of the EU member states by December 23. And many countries indeed did so. So Germany, for example, they passed a national law to implement the minimum tax directive in December 23. The US, obviously one of the most important players when it comes to the coordination of global tax rules, never approved the measures. So Congress has by now never passed any law to implement the global minimum tax, despite being part of the, obviously the G20 group that initially agreed on the minimum tax. And now there's a new president, and just I think last week the new president Donald Trump, the newly elected president, declared that a global corporate minimum tax deal, and now I'm citing, has no force or effect in the US. So I think this means that he effectively pulled out America out of the 2021 agreement. Sean will share more insights on that, but that's my interpretation. And even more, in a presidential memorandum that he issued literally hours after taking office, he ordered the US Treasury to prepare options for, citing again, uh, protective measures against countries that have or are likely to put in place tax rules that disproportionately affect American companies. So that is a little bit of the quick insight on the history of the global minimum tax. And now we're, of course, all wondering, what does all this imply for the future of the global minimum tax and even more generally for the future of internationally coordinated tax rules? What will the US now do? And given how the US will behave, what are the implications for Europe? So among others, these are the questions that we would like to discuss today. And I'm super happy that we have three very distinguished experts here today who, I think from day one have followed and even, I think it's fair to say, shaped the BEPS initiative. And they have contributed significantly to the scientific and also the public debate on the topic. So let me introduce the three speakers quickly, the three experts. So we have Katarina Nicolai. She's the deputy head of the research area corporate taxation at the Center for European Economic Research, so ZEW. And she's also a board member of the Mannheim Taxation Research Cluster, which is, together with ZEW, co-hosting today's event. Katharina received her PhD from the University of Mannheim after receiving a master's degree from Tübingen. And in her research, she has extensively worked on relevant topics, profit shifting, international tax rules, and she has also consulted several governments and international organizations on topics related to international tax policy and specifically the BEPS project. Katharina, great to have you here. We're also happy to have Sean Bray here. Sean is the Vice President of Global Projects at Tax Foundation and Policy Director of Tax Foundations Europe, where he researches on international tax issues with a focus on tax policy in Europe. Prior to joining Tax Foundation, he worked in the US Senate, and I think he's also an American citizen, and interned at the European Parliament. So he has both really the view of an American, but also lots of experience and insights on Europe. He has a master's degree from the College of Europe and holds multiple degrees from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Yeah, I think he's a very well-known member in the international, tax community. Sean, great to have you. Then we have Christoph Spengel. He holds the chair of business taxation at the University of Mannheim, and he is the founder and still a board member of the Mannheim Taxation Research Initiative. He got his PhD from the University of Mannheim and then held professorships in Hamburg and Gießen before he returned to Mannheim as full professor. He's certainly one of the leading experts in the field of international taxation. His impressive list of research publications includes works on topics such as tax planning, profit shifting, tax competition, and tax harmonization and tax competition. He has followed the BEPS project ever since it started and even before that. And many governments and international organizations consult him to benefit from his large expertise. Christoph, thanks for being with us. My name is Philipp Dörnberg. I hold a professorship at the University of Mannheim Business School. I'm currently the speaker of the Mannheim Taxation Cluster, and I'm happy to moderate today's event. So what are we going to do the next, 53-ish minutes? So we'll have our three experts talking. They will be kicking off, each with a presentation that will cover different aspects of the debate. Christoph will talk a little bit of the background, the history, and the motivation of the BEPS project. Katharina will share her insights on how the minimum tax works and how it could theoretically function in a world where important countries are not part of it. And Sean will provide insights on the US debate and what it implies for Europe. Of course, we want this to be interactive. So after the three initial kickoff presentations, there will be time for Q&A. I might have a few questions, but I would really like to open the floor to the audience and to all of you very soon to make sure that you get to ask the questions that you are interested in. To ask questions, so technically important, there's this, you should see this Q&A panel. For those that have a German Zoom version, it's called F&A. So you can put in your questions there, write them down there, and I will then see them and I can forward the questions then to our experts. Good, thank you very much. Christoph, you're up first, and I'm looking forward to your presentation, and then subsequently Katharina and Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining this webinar. I had a quick look at the list, and some of you are very familiar with me, and I see a really international audience. So I was asked, to start a bit setting the scene about, the origins of the idea of the global minimum tax, and maybe finally to set a hypothesis. What is it all about? And what does it mean? That's today's topic, that the United States, but no one talks about China. It's also in the club, not joining this initiative. So it came up a bit more than 10 years ago that journalists published really reliable data on effective tax rates of well-known US multinationals they pay on their overseas profits. That means outside the US, and these numbers really are pretty low. And that, was the starting point for a political process that the G20 leaders mandated the OECD to elaborate on what Philip mentioned on base erosion and profit shifting. So what are the channels of profit shifting and what can be done to reduce profit shifting by multinationals? And as Philip mentioned, okay, this initiative from the start was accompanied by a huge involvement of the global world, the inclusive framework, containing almost 140 countries, but it was all political. Okay, political means okay, I agree, but I'm not legally, binding in a way. And differently from that, the European Commission, right from the start, took certain measures, which I will briefly comment on, and put that into binding law, into directives, which have been decided upon unanimously in Brussels, and then had to be implemented into domestic law of the member states. And what I really would like to draw your attention, that the initiative of whole BEPS has been based on a miracle that has been misleading. If you look at the BEPS reports, in the start, the first one, the second one, there were no numbers out about what is it all about, what's the magnitude of profit shifting. The first number brought out was about in 2013-14 by an NGO, the Tax Justice Network, headed by Ed Murphy. And that was a study on behalf of the socialist parties in the European Parliament. And Ed Murphy dealt upon the magnitude of the total tax gap in the EU. So what is a tax gap? The tax gap is the collected tax revenue in cash compared to the expected tax revenue member states might collect if all taxable income, all taxable transactions really were taxed. And the numbers, say the hypothetical numbers, were derived from national accounts, which is very problematic, a lot of estimates and so forth. And the tax gap was estimated as an amount for Europe, roughly 969 billion euro. And Ed Murphy, in his report, wrote, from that 969 billion euro, about 900 billion euro stem from tax evasion, from black money, from VAT fraud, so illegal things. And that means if we draw our attention on the topic, what is, tax reduction by profit shifting, that might be 69 billion for the EU as a whole, very problematic. But what the politicians do, and you can read that up in minutes in the European Parliament, you can read that in minutes in the German Parliament, 969 billion, that's not, make it 1 trillion, eine Billiarde. 1 trillion, that's tax evasion, okay? It's a miracle, and it's not accurate. Then what happened in my country, so I stepped to Germany, and some of my colleagues, say not from Mannheim, say from the capital, they came up with a number that German multinationals are responsible for shifting profits, tax base at an amount of almost 39 billion euro. And I took that number and said, hey, that's more than 50% that the Tax Justice Network was estimated, and 50% for Germany. No, that cannot be true. We checked the equation, we found an error, and we recalculated the calculations and came up maximum 7.7 billion. And then given time and more accurate data, Cardi was involved, propensity score matching, it was about 5 billion. So the most recent number that came up for Germany was 2 billion by the IFO Institute in Munich. A good estimate based on country by country data, but 2 billion. Okay, what's 2 billion? That's about 20% of the tax revenue that the tobacco tax in Germany generates. And finally, after the law was amended in Germany, the German government came up with 20 million. So we could talk about what is it all about? Yeah, no revenue, but there are additional costs. But this initiative, actually, the BEPS, that was accompanied by shitstorms, okay, in the public, Panama Papers, LuxLeak, and all that stuff that we pointed, not we, the politicians pointed their thumb, on the nasty multinationals. And then there came the digital economy. Well, Uber being very successful, owning no cars, Facebook very successful, producing no content, and finally,
Do you still hear him, or is it just me? I think we lost the connection to Christoph.
He didn't even mention Zoom. That's unfortunate.
Okay, so he's not coming back. So I think he was approaching the end of his presentation anyway, and we can ask him later what else he wanted to say. So Katharina, should we just go on?
Yes, of course.
Okay,
Yeah,
Katharina.
my presentation is not going forward. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we hear you
Yeah.
well, and we see the slides.
And that is great. So thanks for having me. Well, essentially, the global minimum tax was promoted as a blueprint for a successful global cooperation. And the central idea was that if introduced on a global scale, this would reduce negative side effects in terms of location disadvantages as opposed to unilateral introduction of anti-avoidance rules, for example. And if we look at, and this is also why initially 137 countries signed the idea of the global minimum tax, which is quite an impressive number. But if we look now at a map showing the adoption of the rules and implementation into domestic law, we can see that only 36 countries are left. So all the others have not yet implemented the rule. And out of these 36 countries, these are mostly EU countries, because in the EU we have the directive enforcing the implementation of the global minimum tax. And yeah, so this per se does not mean that the global minimum tax is not working, because as I will show in a minute, there are regulations in place that ensure that a global minimum tax of 15% is also ensured if a country is not implementing the rule. I will show how that works. But also we will see that there will be a new division line in tax competition between those countries that followed the initial idea of introducing global minimum tax and those that are not following. Okay, so in a nutshell, there are three mechanisms that make sure that multinational profits are taxed effectively at a minimum rate of 15%, regardless of the country they operate in. And the primary instrument is the income inclusion rule, which applies to the ultimate parent or also intermediate parents. And then as a backstop, there's a secondary instrument that also works when the countries where the parents are located did not implement the global minimum tax, and this is the undertaxed profits rule. And as a third element, we have the qualified domestic top-up tax, which gives low-tax countries the right to collect the additional revenue from the top-up tax. And well, I brought some really stylized examples to illustrate two things. First, the location disadvantage between groups operating in regions where the global minimum tax applies and those which have no ties to regions where the global minimum tax applies. And secondly, I will show that the functioning of the rules in case the US, or in the case that we have now, that the US is not implementing the rule, but still some of the US group's entities might be subject to the global minimum tax. So here I'm opposing the US group, and I'm assuming there is no entity in the EU, and in no other country where the global minimum tax is implemented, and I compare that to a situation of an EU parent. And I'm assuming that both parents have effective tax rate of 28%, and they are investing in low tax entities with a tax rate of 10%. And since the US is not implementing the global minimum tax, the group can still take the tax advantage from allocating profits or investments to the low tax jurisdiction, while in case of the EU, the income inclusion rule would apply, and there will be a top-up tax because the low tax entity has an effective tax rate below 15%. If I now modify the example in a way that the US group has an intermediate parent in the EU, then the income inclusion rule still applies. So there's no necessity that the ultimate parent must implement the global minimum tax. It's sufficient that here the income inclusion rule applies at the intermediate parent, and it is subject to the income inclusion rule top-up tax for the foreign low tax entity. And here this reduces the tax advantage from allocating profits or investments to low tax jurisdictions as intended by the global minimum tax. But also it introduces an incentive to restructure the multinational, because if you compare that to the structure before, the application could be avoided if the intermediate parent is located outside the scope of the global minimum tax. And last example, here there is no parent in the EU, but just one entity in this example here, and there might be several low tax entities of the US parent outside the scope of the global minimum tax. And here the backstop rule of the undertax profits rule applies, and the EU entity is subject to the undertax profits top-up tax regarding the low tax group profits. So yeah, there's still a tax burden levied on these low tax entities. And again, there's an incentive to restructure the multinational in a way that the US parent might want to get rid of the EU entity to avoid the application of the undertax profits rule. So to sum up, what are the consequences from the lack in global cooperation? Well, first of all, for firms in countries like the EU or Europe in general, which implemented the global minimum tax, they face a higher tax burden and restricted opportunities for tax planning, and as well high compliance costs of the implementation of the global minimum tax and the complexity to administer it. And then, as the stylized examples show, there are incentives for relocation and restructuring to avoid constituent entities in regions where the global minimum tax is implemented. And then if countries try to enforce the undertax payment rule, for example, or the income inclusion rule in case of US multinationals, there is the threat that the US might introduce protective measures as a threat. And finally, well, the fact that the US is not implementing the rule is kind of a signal to those countries that have not yet implemented the global minimum tax, and it signals that it is not a global standard, it will not become a global standard, and they might decide not to join. And countries outside the EU that are not bounded by the EU directive might also decide to step back from that regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kati. Very interesting. I'm sure there's plenty of additional questions we would have, but let's first give it to Sean and let him share his perspective as an American in Europe. Sean, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. I always like to start by saying, especially after having gone to the College of Europe, that being European is actually a way of thinking, not a place you're born. And so despite my passport location, I think I'm sufficiently in the bubble, let's say. But I was asked to speak a bit about the US perspective here, and I can do so. And I think Christoph laid out a bit simply before his computer died, and Katerina as well, a bit of the picture and how we got here and some of the maybe myths that drove us here. But I'm going to do three things. I'm just going to discuss a bit why the US did not adopt it, Pillar 2, let's say, even before President Trump joined the White House. The second is to question what we are trying to achieve by Pillar 2. And third, what it means for the EU, this fact that the US will not be joining. So I think it is true that President Trump, when he came into office, made it incredibly clear that the United States will not be adopting Pillar 2. I think that was a shock for only people who were not paying attention to begin with, because President Trump simply said out loud what every tax expert in the United States already understood. Most people in the United States understood that when the Build Back Better proposal, which had come through the US Congress under President Biden, did not pass Congress with Pillar 2 modifications, I think that was the opportunity that many saw as the chance for the United States to join Pillar 2, and it was rejected, notably by Senator Joe Manchin and Senator Kristen Sinema. They are Democrats. They needed the two Democrats in Congress to be able to do so. And the question was, well, the United States had agreed to this at the OECD. Why is the United States not following through on its promises? The first point to mention is that Janet Yellen, the former Treasury Secretary, agreed to this agreement at the OECD from the executive branch. But ultimately, tax laws need to go through Congress in the United States, and the Congress rejected it. So the first mistake was actually on Secretary Yellen by not confirming in Congress that she had the votes to actually agree at the OECD to pass this. And as it turned out, she did not. So the US had never been part of Pillar 2 even before President Trump came in. And there are some reasons why many in Congress did not see it as a good move for the United States to join the Pillar 2 model rules. The first was revenue. It was unclear that the United States Treasury would benefit from this from a revenue perspective. The Treasury estimates were positive, meaning revenue coming into the United States, but there were many estimates provided after that point that show that depending on your assumptions, that may or may not actually be true. So the first question was, why should we actually adopt something that is going to be neutral or negative to our revenue base? The second was the United States already has a global minimum tax. It's called GILTI, and we passed it under the TCJA reforms in 2017. GILTI is not Pillar 2. It has a similar function, but it's not exactly the same. The main difference is that it's blended revenue adjustment, not country by country, whereas Pillar 2 is a country by country system. But ultimately, the outcomes of these policies are relatively similar in that they are designed to stop egregious profit shifting and tax evasion by multinationals around the world. So we already had GILTI before Pillar 2. And the question was, why should we change our GILTI to look like Pillar 2 when we already have this one? And by moving from GILTI to Pillar 2, we actually may not gain revenue and we could actually lose revenue. The third question was, or the third contention was, the way that our tax credits work in the United States was not allowed under the Pillar 2 rules. And the way we do tax credits, we do refundable tax credits, we do non-refundable tax credits, and most of the rest of the world does refundable tax credits, meaning if you do not owe any corporate income tax under a refundable system, you can still get your tax money from the government In our system, if you do not owe, you do not get tax credit. So effectively, a refundable tax credit can work like a subsidy. In the United States, it cannot. And so under the Pillar 2 rules, our tax credits were disadvantaged relative to the rest of the world. And our tax credits, to change them would be incredibly complicated politically and technically. Finally, there's the UTPR, which was mentioned, which essentially allows a foreign government to reach into the pockets of the US Treasury and take profit out of the United States, despite the fact that the United States Congress had never agreed to this law. And that was seen, and is still currently seen, as a fundamental problem of the Pillar 2 rules, from a tax sovereignty perspective, but again, from a fiscal perspective. So I think it's easy to blame President Trump, and he can be blamed for many things these days. But one of the things he cannot be blamed for is pulling us out of this agreement, because number one, we were never in it. And number two, it was a pretty broad consensus bipartisanly of why we were not going to join it. So what are we trying to do with Pillar 2? The question is now that the United States is not joining. Well, as I think Christoph was mentioning and was going to continue mentioning, the promise of revenue was always the key, and the OECD and Christoph walked through some of the numbers. Profits upon profits would be coming to all these countries, and as Katerina mentioned, the UTPR would be the enforcement mechanism, and no matter what, as long as you adopted Pillar 2, you were able to gain fiscally from this system. As of last weekend, we have European Commission officials coming out and saying, well, actually, we're not making too much revenue. We didn't plan to. This is more of a behavioral tax. Revenue is not really that important. In my opinion, that's just inaccurate based on the history of the OECD process and all the promises that were made to try to adopt this Pillar 2. So if it's not about revenue, what is it about? Well, you could argue it's about fairness, and you could argue it's about making corporations pay their fair share, which in and of itself is fine. But as I mentioned previously, there are many things done under BEPS 1.0, CFC rules, and in the European Union, there was ATAD, et cetera, that addressed a lot of the egregious profit shifting issues. And once we adopted GILTI in the United States under the TCJ reform, a large majority of the problems we were trying to solve were taken care of. You could argue that there's still some to be left, so we should attack those things, and I would agree. But I think it's much better to use the tools you already have than develop a whole new system on top of the rules you already have, because the gains from doing so are very small relative to the costs of doing so. The reason there was not good studies on how much we had solved with BEPS 1.0 and TCJ reform was because we started this process almost immediately after those legislations came into place around the world. And so again, you can question, even if you have a good motivation for doing something, maybe you need some time to actually assess and evaluate whether the things you have already done have accomplished what you were trying to accomplish. So finally, what does it mean for the EU at this point? It's true that the UTPR is supposed to work as an enforcement mechanism, but I've always questioned that in the sense that, specifically for Europe, in a globalized world where countries are friendly and the priority is to maintain friendliness, I think that mechanism would have worked quite well. In a world that is less friendly and more retaliation-based, simply the UTPR will just invite retaliation. And so it will serve less as an enforcement function and more as a retaliation function, which I don't think originally was the plan, of course, but in reality, that is what it seems to be. The other thing to mention is China, the United States, and India have not adopted this. And so Europe really is the largest economy that has it, but the other large players in the world do not have it. So you could face a real lose-lose in Europe, where all EU firms are essentially dealing with the compliance costs of Pillar 2 internally. They are facing externally the retaliation from the UTPR enforcement, and the governments are not actually generating the revenue that they were promised to generate. So here we are back to what are we doing this for and what are we accomplishing with this? And in fact, I think I will conclude by saying the decluttering project in Europe is a great opportunity to fix this big mistake. When we talk about decluttering in Europe, it should start with Pillar 2, not end with Pillar 2, in my opinion, because many of the things we were trying to solve have already been solved. And so I'll stop there and, of course, be happy to take questions and discussion. Thank you.
So just to double check, so you were suggesting the EU should effectively take back its global minimum tax directive.
Based on the variables that were laid out of the reasons to do so, I don't see many of those variables actually being successful. And in fact, they are negative. And so the question is, why should you keep it otherwise?
Okay, that's a very clear statement. So this is actually the question along which I wanted to organize the discussion. So what should Europe do given the development that we have in the US, but also, as you mentioned rightly, I think India and China. So Christoph, we lost you unfortunately, but I know you have worked a lot on the compliance costs, and I think in order to make a fair decision on what the EU should do now, this is a very important component, as Sean also mentioned. So there's revenue, there's retaliation, there's the compliance costs, but there's also the competitive disadvantages. Maybe Katharina can elaborate a little bit on that. But Christoph, so the compliance costs, what are your estimates? How high are they, and are they, in a cost benefit calculation, do they justify the benefits of the global minimum tax in your view? And does that view change at all, given the new situation that the US is never, probably, as Sean said, gonna join the agreement?
Yeah, thanks for being back. 20 years before I would have been nervous, so solved the technical problem. Maybe first to jump in Sean's argument, which I totally agree, say from a European perspective, that the global minimum tax at hand, being a legally binding law, is ring fencing the EU. It's ring fencing the EU, to put that very simple, that an EU-based multinational should pay ideally in each jurisdiction worldwide it operates at least 15%, whereas non-cooperating multinationals or from non-cooperating countries like the US or China or India, they have only to take into account their European exposure with the 15%, and if they build around the EU, so the rest of the world, it's not binding. And that's ring fencing, and that's an advantage for the EU as a whole. And what we know from international tax competition, if tax planning is restricted, that will have real effects on the location of investment, and that's all about work and growth. And so I totally agree, say, with reasonable people like Sean and me, for the EU as a whole, we should think of, the European ministers to get rid of this nonsense. And it is nonsense because, today in the German newspapers, you can read that the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, was allowed by the European Commission to subsidize a new production plant by Infineon in North Rhine-Westphalia by 967 million euro. So that's not the end of tax competition. Beyond the bottom line, you just take cash. And so you see, it's just nonsense. And Philip, you mentioned that nonsense comes at a cost, because companies, and we have about 450 affected companies in Germany, they have to file their tax returns. They have to file it by now for the year 2024, and that causes compliance costs on the one hand. And on the other hand, the administration has to control for that, given that there is almost no revenue, because the qualified domestic top-up tax levied by low tax jurisdiction, they get a little revenue, and the high tax countries, they just pay costs. And it might be the situation that costs outweigh extra revenue, and I mentioned that before I dropped out, that the most recent number for Germany is 20 million euro expected revenue. And we estimated about 150 million running compliance and administrative costs. So it's actually negative by 130 million, and that's incredible. So thanks.
Thank you, Christoph. So there's an agreement here. Katharina, so let's, again, we're trying to pursue the question what Europe should do. And I think that requires the thought experiment, what would happen if Europe did not do it? So it did not take it back. So if Europe kept to the state with the rules that it has now. Aside from the things that Sean and Christoph now elaborate, how do you think a European firm will respond to this? So you're a European firm, you're based in Europe that has the directive, that has the national laws, and now you have the US, China, India not having the minimum tax. Does that have any implications of, how the firm operates, how it decides upon investments, etc.?
Yeah, so, well, when you speak about a thought experiment, well, yeah, if you think back to a time where before BEPS, then high tax rates in Europe were more viable because multinationals still had the option to channel profits to low tax jurisdictions. And now there are so many rules in place that make these strategies no longer possible. And well, there are specific rules. Christoph mentioned ATAD, for example, that are targeting specific profit shifting strategies. And then on top of that, now we have the global minimum tax. So definitely this channel out of these high tax locations is no longer possible for European firms. So there is a larger weight of the high corporate income tax rate in the member states, and well, that will affect location choices for future investments. And there are the incentives, tax incentives to locate this activity out of Europe, and yeah, and then well, or to move the entire activity outside the scope of the application of the global minimum tax. So, and this would be extremely harmful for the economies in Europe.
Donald Trump would like it.
Yeah.
So Sean, you made a very clear point. Europe should pull out of this. Do you think Europe should do anything instead of the global minimum tax? I know, there's lots of discussions on, if we don't have a global minimum tax, we still want to get, hands on the tech companies. So something like the digital services taxes, is this something that Europe should follow up on instead of global minimum tax? So what's your view generally, what Europe should do instead, if anything at all?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I actually just wanted to follow up with a few things that were mentioned to just add to them, and then I can, of course, answer this question. I think something that's quite, there are a few ironies actually here with Pillar 2 in Europe. The first is that there's been studies on this that by shutting down the, let's say, for example, US companies investing in a low tax jurisdiction and then using that money to invest in Europe. There's a theory, and I think it's quite understandable, that by having Pillar 2 and essentially disincentivizing this transfer from a low tax to a high tax jurisdiction in Europe, you will actually get less investment in high tax jurisdictions in Europe because of Pillar 2. So countries like Germany, countries like France, countries that have the big, high marginal tax rates on investment will actually not benefit from Pillar 2 in the sense that the revenue that they are gaining or not gaining from the Pillar 2 enforcement, they will actually be losing from less growth because there will be less investment from the money moving through low tax jurisdictions into high tax jurisdictions. So the irony is that the countries that were pushing for this the most to quote unquote save the welfare state are actually going to be losing not only on the revenue side and the compliance cost side, but also on the less investment side, because the money will, it makes less sense to invest in a higher tax jurisdiction. Number two, as Christoph mentioned, Pillar 2 puts us essentially in a subsidy race rather than a tax competition race on tax rates. And I think another irony of all of this is that some of the motivation, as Christoph mentioned, for the Pillar 2 project was, of course, this view that there were corrupt politicians and corrupt businesses that were making deals with each other, etc. Well, moving from a tax rate competition where every firm in the economy can benefit from the corporate tax rate, whereas a subsidy race, not only does it invite less neutrality because it invites more backroom deals between politicians and companies directly. And if you're not part of the group, you cannot benefit from the subsidy. And number two, Europe as a whole actually does not, of all the major players in the world, it's the only one that does not have taxing authority and cannot raise its own revenue to give out in subsidies. So Europe has put itself in a position where it's in a subsidy race under Pillar 2, but China can raise its own money, India can raise its own money, the United States can raise its own money, the EU cannot raise its own money to give out as subsidies. So why would you want to put yourself in a position to do that? Finally, I think it's important to mention the compliance costs. I think it's easy to say, well, big companies can pay compliance, it's no big deal. There are millions of economic studies showing that the effects of more compliance costs hurt not only stakeholders, but also workers and also consumers. And so it's very flip to say, well, compliance costs, who cares? They're rich companies, no big deal. It is actually a big deal, not only for the rich people who invest, but also for the workers and the consumers who participate. So with that all being said, what should Europe do? Is a DST a better alternative? The short answer is, of course, no, because it's, again, not solving the problem. It will once again just be a retaliation mechanism rather than some kind of changing behavior of other countries. And in fact, there are more efficient ways to raise revenue if that's the goal. And so first, Europe needs to decide what is the goal. Is it to raise revenue? I think that's what it should be, efficiently. And number two, to support growth in the economy, because as we know, across Europe, growth is lagging, even in countries like Germany and France now. And so modifying the VAT, which to give them credit, the European Commission has worked on quite a bit over the last few years to include digital services more and more. Using the VAT system is a much more efficient way to actually gain revenue and generate growth if that's the objective, which in my opinion, it should be. So my final recommendation in that sense would be, what should Europe do? Stop burdening your own companies, giving them disadvantages internally, and focus on policies that would actually drive growth throughout Europe.
Thank you. I would have a lot more interesting questions, but I would really like to open the Q&A session to the audience. So as I said, there's this Q&A, or for the Germans, F&A button that you should see in your Zoom window, and you can just put in your questions there, and I will then see them here and forward them to our speakers. One question that I got already is, what is the interaction with, the threat? I think at this point it's only a threat. The threat of tariffs that the US will impose. Does that have any tax? I think we should focus on tax. Does that have any tax implications for Europe? How should Europe react to that? I think that's an interesting question, given what Donald Trump is, communicating these days. Maybe Sean, do you have a view on this?
Sorry, whether tariffs are a good idea, is that the bottom line here?
No, well, if the US will impose tariffs on, say, German cars, would there have to be a European tax reaction to that?
It's an interesting question. I've been making the point recently that tax and trade are more connected than they've really ever been in a transatlantic sense. Sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly. We've seen in the last few weeks VAT been called a tariff and an export subsidy at the same time, and that's nonsense. It's clearly trade neutral, and that's not even, you can't find a serious economist who calls it a tariff. But when you have the Venn diagram loop of things that are crossing into the retaliation world, I would see very clearly UTPR, I would see very clearly DSTs, and you could probably throw CBAM in there as well, given that there's no export subsidies. So it's not really a border adjustment, it's more of a tariff. Okay. there are things that Europe can do from a tax perspective to offset tariffs. I guess if the goal is to retaliate and or make life harder for U.S. companies because there are tariffs coming onto German cars, for example. But my colleague Erica York has had a great quote, and I will use it again here because I think it sums it up perfectly. When she was asked about retaliation for tariffs and whether the United States should reciprocate tariffs to increase tariff rates, she basically said, it's like shooting yourself in the foot because somebody else has shot themselves in the foot. And it doesn't make much sense. I mean, I understand the rationale for needing to retaliate when you are facing tariffs from a foreign country. And I think every country should, or the EU in this case, has the right to do so, of course. But it should also be in the best interests of European citizens, whatever the policies are that the European Commission or member state governments decide to take. And so just retaliating for the sake of retaliating may not be the right option unless there's a clear path for some benefits to the European citizen from that retaliation. So tax or trade could be put into that way of thinking.
Okay, thank you. So another question I got, I think, is a very important question too. So now, if I interpret this correctly, there's an agreement among our experts that maybe it's not a good idea whatsoever to have the minimum tax for Europe. So given that we have it, so there's a directive, it was transposed into German law. From a political economy perspective, how likely do you find it that it will ever be suspended again? So Christoph, I think you are a close observer of politics and you're even involved in politics. Do you see a chance that, say, a new German government will make an initiative to really suspend it again? So is that what we're discussing here, even something that's politically feasible? I think that's the question.
It's a hard question. It's a hard question, hard to answer, because as I tried to mention, the directive was adopted, without being aware what it's all about. It was a political issue. It was Germany and France who pushed without having an idea. Now, if I were a policymaker or responsible for that, and if I took it seriously, I would say, okay, it's nothing. It costs, and it's not about, as Sean figured out, it's about, the costs you can measure directly, but indirectly, it hampers investment, it hampers growth, it hampers employment, and so on. And if I want to go for that and convince Europe that there would be better alternatives to promote economic growth, then I should start an initiative and I should convince my partner countries with the strongest economies. Easier said as being done, but we have a lot of issues in Europe, and we should say we should really analyze where we stand as a whole. What are our duties, say defense strategy, climate strategy, and how do we fund that? And I think there were some interesting insights also by Sean. Say, look at the tax mix, direct taxes, the global minimum is a direct tax. Why won't we shift more to indirect taxes and have a better enforcement in the area of internet and so forth? And I think there would be better solutions, and it's up to the policymakers to promote that. I think that the voters don't care that much, because why was it so easily to implement the global minimum tax? Because no voter was affected. It's not BASF, it's not GlaxoSmithKline going to vote in the UK or in Germany. And so that's a bit the issue we talk all about.
Thank you. I think I have another question here that I also had on my list. Kati, I think that's a good one for you. You have worked, you do the ZDW tax index, I think it's called. So I think one other objective that we didn't talk so much about yet is that the whole initiative should end what maybe what's called harmful tax competition. And race to the bottom, countries lowering and lowering their rates all the time, and so eventually we'll get it to a 0 rate at some point. Following up on this idea, so Yeah, what do you make out of that? What do you see in the data? Do you see that indeed now in expectation that we have a minimum tax, that countries, how did they react tax-wise so far? What do you see in the data?
Yes, so you mentioned the Mannheim Tax Index. Maybe I can show that briefly, the most recent update. Mm, Okay, so this is only about profit taxes on corporations in Germany and some selected competitors, plus the US. What it does not include is a shift of tax competition on to subsidies or tax competition for highly skilled employees, for example. It is just corporate income tax rates, and at the end you see the gray part. So this would be reform options, and generally what we can see is that there is no longer an aggressive aggressive corporate income tax reforms in the EU, so no race to the bottom here. So the lowest line here, Estonia, is even increasing the tax rate. So the EU countries come closer together, and yeah, so no indication of tax rate competition here. In contrast, we simulated also the reform for the US, which will bring the US effective average tax rate down to roughly about 15%. So it is clear that well, within the EU, there is no longer the incentive to be really aggressive in corporate income tax rate, but outside the scope of the application of the global minimum tax, there is, of course, still the possibility to grant tax advantage to firms by cutting the corporate income tax.
Thanks. So we have 2 more minutes, so maybe one last question. The focus of this event is, and rightly is, on Pillar 2 and the minimum tax, but let me conclude maybe with one question about Pillar 1 too. So given all these developments, so Pillar 1, just to remind everyone, is this idea that taxation should be there where consumers are, so where the sales actually happen. And there's also a question from the audience about proposals going into that direction. So Sean, what's your expectation regarding Pillar 1? Is anything gonna happen there?
The short answer is no, and that was even less likely than Pillar 2 because in the US Senate you need 67 votes, and that was never going to happen. There's many proposals about formulary apportionment. We have many resources on our website. The United States already uses formulary apportionment within its states, and there are some advantages, a lot of problems. So I'd encourage anyone to go look up those resources if they're interested.
Okay, thank you. That was a short, clear final statement. So I thank everyone. We had, I think, almost 130 interested people attending, and I thought it was a very interesting and insightful debate. Katharina, Sean, and Christoph, thank you very, very much for sharing your expertise, and hope to see you all soon again at one of these lunch events, digital lunch events, and maybe also in person somewhere else. Thank you very much.